Tonight's stream, focusing on a couple of different things, just like we always do in AP World. We're going to focus on some content as well as some skills. So we'll be making connections and overviewing topic 4.6 if you're using those numbers in your class. But really, we're talking about resistance to empire. So with internal and external, some religious resistance, some social resistance. There'll be practice questions as we go. And then near the end of the stream, some ideas if there are any teachers out there thinking about how to cover this in your classroom, we'll be able to go over some of that information as well. So I want to start us off with a document, and sometimes a document means text, but today we're bringing you an image. So 2 questions right here on the screen with the image itself. First question is asking you, what do you think this image is? What's going on in this picture? And this is one of those times where I would love your best guesses. Even if you're not entirely sure, putting a guess right there in the chat would be awesome. If you're not entirely sure what the image is, you could also answer that second question. What stands out to you about what's going on in this picture? Okay, we got a guess, conquistadors meeting and talking about trade. Sasha, what makes you think that we're dealing with conquistadors in this image? Because definitely that's a great guess for the time period. Hats, yes, we've got the hats. Right. Sometimes as we're looking at these images, things like hats and clothes can be really important. So we've got some guys who are clearly European based on their dress. They've got the funny pants and they've got the hats with the feathers. We definitely, on the left-hand side of the image, have some Europeans. We've got someone in the center. Kylie says it appears as if somebody's begging. It's a possibility. Yeah. So this picture is actually an image depicting an African queen, Nzinga, and her negotiations with the Portuguese who were coming into her territory. So the center figure, the seated figure is Queen Nzinga, and her servants and her people are going to be off to the right. The Portuguese are off to the left in this image. And she's going to be an example of someone who resisted European imperial efforts. You might notice in the image that she is sitting on top of a person. You might think that's kind of weird. Why would she be, why do you think she's sitting on top of another person? I'm going to take a best guess about what might be going on there. Okay, she's important. I mean, I told you that she's a queen. And the fact that she's sitting on someone else, right, does suggest that she's important. In fact, the Portuguese refused to give her a chair during their negotiations and their meetings, and she wanted to sit down. And so she called over, you're right, she called over one of her servants and had him kneel down as her stool because she wasn't going to be disrespected by the Portuguese. You know, it's like, fine, don't give me a chair. I'm going to bring my own chair and I'm going to sit down and I'm going to have this discussion from what I see as a position of power. And so as we're thinking about resistance to empire, we're going to see a lot of maybe in some cases surprising examples like this, where we're seeing people who in some versions of world history don't get talked about a lot or don't get thought of as having any real power against the Europeans, but in fact really do have real power and make a significant difference for their people in terms of resisting what the Europeans and other empires are trying to do as they expand in different territories around the world. And so as we're thinking about this content, we can also be thinking about another important AP skill, and it's the skill of making connections. Eric is doing a great job of pointing out resources. Yep, if you've got a Fiveable Plus membership, you should be able to see resources below the stream here if you're with us live. Or if you're watching the replay, they'll also be at the bottom of the screen. There's a link to a graphic history of Queen Nzinga in the resources below. And by graphic history, he means awesome, like graphic novel, comic book style history. I went to the page recently as I was doing some of my own research on this topic, and she's really cool. And this resource is a really awesome way to access this history about Queen Nzinga. So definitely check that out if you're interested in more about her. But the skill that we're looking at today is making connections. And it's a really big skill, and it's a really important skill for AP World History. So as we're thinking about making connections, we are thinking about, right, here's the language here on the right from the College Board. It says, using historical reasoning processes analyze patterns and connections between and among historical developments and processes. And then there's kind of two subtopics within that. Let me break down what this means. Making connections, the skill of making connections, refers to the ability to see connections across both space and time. So sometimes we're going to make connections between one place and another place. And sometimes, other times, we're going to be making connections across time. So from one point in history to another point in history. And we're linking together ideas about history. That's what making connections really is. It's in a lot of ways really similar to the historical reasoning skill of comparison, because we want to think about similarities and differences. We want to think about, oh, okay, in this place and in this place, we've got the connection of something being the same. We can also see a link between this connection skill and the skill of causation, right? Causation is a connection. One thing causes another to happen. So comparison, causation, and connections are all related skills. They're not identical. But oftentimes, if you're practicing one of those skills, it will help you to practice the other skills. And so as I'm thinking about making connections and thinking about, right, what do I know about the empires? And that can help me. So I'm connecting, oh, okay, so if I know that the Portuguese Empire is a trading post empire, and that the Portuguese were less involved in land conquest and more involved in trading posts and creating trade connections in their empire. That might be a way for me to better understand how the Portuguese are interacting in Africa or in India or even in the Americas, because I know that about them. So making connections between my knowledge, between my information. So we'll be practicing that skill with our practice questions as we go through this content of empires and resistance to the empires. So I know that's kind of like a big whirlwind, kind of broad paintbrush of what we're looking at tonight. But Mr. Little has given me a nice helpful pause slide right here. Any questions, things that you are wondering about? Because of course, we've got this whole stream slideshow put together for you, but if there's something you want to know about, we want to be sure that we respond to that. So I'll pause just a moment and see if anyone's got any questions to start us off. Is there a way to, Sasha's asking, is there a way to access the history for free? Are you asking about the history of Queen Nzinga? Let me pull up the link and I'll drop it in the chat for you. Since you're here live, you might as well get it for you. Absolutely. Yes, it's not a pay-gated site. We just happen, our resources for Fiveable are posted for Plus members. They're just linked right to the slideshows. But if you are on a free account right now, because you haven't signed up for Plus yet, that's okay. There's the link right there that'll take you straight to the graphic history about Queen Nzinga. I happen to have that one. That one I had bookmarked for you. All right. So let's dive in to thinking about these resistance movements and what we're talking about here. So first thing I want to kind of frame us with is this topic. And if your teacher is using the new AP World course description, this is part of Unit 4. Unit 4 is the transoceanic empires. Really, we could also talk about this with Unit 3 and the land empires, but the College Board sticks it in Unit 4 because it probably makes the most sense to talk about this topic once you've started talking about the Europeans, and they're the transoceanic empires. But they're not the only empire builders. So, right, we're in this theme of governance. Or if you're like my students using the Spice Tea mnemonic or one of those other mnemonics, your governance theme, you might also have it as politics. So we're under that kind of political or governance heading. And specifically, the language from the College Board is in 2 key points that we want you to know. So the first is this idea that state expansion and centralization led to resistance from an array of social, political, and economic groups on a local level, which is very teachery language. So let's break down what we're talking about. Anytime we see that word state, what are we talking about? For my US students, this can be sometimes one of the most challenging words in the course. What do we mean by state in a world history context? Anybody know? Kylie, you got a guess for me? Sasha? Ooh, Sasha's got a guess. Government or territory. So in general, the state usually refers to the government. Yeah, so we're thinking, and that sometimes it could refer to the place, the territory, the physical land itself. But when we mean state, we're meaning government. It's more synonymous with country than with a state like in the United States. And that's a whole complicated thing why we're called the United States of America. You can ask your US teacher, US history teacher about that, whatever year you take US history. But yeah, we're not talking about a section within a country, but a whole country itself. So as governments, or countries, or empires expanded, as they got bigger, or as they centralized, as they consolidated their power to one person or one group of people, both of those processes lead to resistance. Because not everybody's happy with the expansion of empires or with the centralization of power within empires. So it leads to resistance from an array or a variety of social, political, and economic groups on a local level. So all that means is that in particular places, different kinds of groups resisted in different ways. Some groups resisted socially in terms of class structures and interactions. A lot of the resistance movements that we'll look at today are political in nature, so direct resistance to the government, but then also economic resistance and a disruption of the economic systems being created by these new empires. The second subpoint really gets its own subpoint because it's not a unique kind of resistance, but a kind of resistance that doesn't get enough attention if we don't name it specifically. So in addition to kind of the general resistance movements that we see, we also see specifically slave resistance that challenges the authorities in the Americas. And this is important to keep in mind. And for Unit 4, for Unit 4, this is really important to keep in mind because this is the time period of the Atlantic slave trade. And too often, history curriculum and history texts have taught the slave trade in a way that makes Africans seem helpless. But the true reality is that Africans frequently resisted being enslaved. And so the resistance of enslaved people gets its own mention and really deserves its own mention in AP World History because we want to acknowledge the power, the dignity, the personhood, and in some cases, the success of slave resistance movements. So that's like the College Board language of what we're talking about here. If you are in a classroom where your teachers are using some of the older language around the key concepts, this also relates back to key concept 4.3, which is, again, very similar language, just a little different from the way it's being presented today. But state consolidation and imperial expansion, competition over trade routes, state rivalries, and local resistance all provided challenges to state consolidation and expansion. It's worded a little bit differently here because it's including some ideas about empires were challenged by outside forces as well as internal forces. And we do want to acknowledge both of those things. So that's where we are in the key concepts or in the course outline. That's kind of where we're focusing here. That's the big idea. But we want to start getting into some specifics because we're almost 20 minutes in. So let's get you some specifics to put into your notes, okay? We're going to start with some vocabulary. This is not an all-inclusive vocabulary of everything you should know about resistance, but these are 4 terms that when you're thinking about resistance are good terms to keep in mind because they give us 4 examples of resistance in different parts of the world, which is always good to have examples from lots of different places to be able to make different kinds of connections, which is what we're all about tonight. So in the top left, you can see our first vocab term is maroon, which is, in world history terms, not a color. Instead, a maroon is a term for communities of people founded by runaway enslaved peoples and by Native Americans in the Americas. And so as enslaved peoples would escape from slavery and leave the places where they had been enslaved, they would go and create new communities in the Americas. It was almost impossible for enslaved peoples to return to Africa, even if they wished to do so. The transportation was so monopolized by Europeans, they simply would have been re-enslaved had they attempted to do that. And so we don't see that. Instead, we see new communities being formed. And Native American populations sometimes blended with these enslaved peoples to create new populations. And so this term maroon refers to those groups of people who are resisting enslavement by Europeans in the Americas, in part by creating separate communities and by living their lives as resistance to that slave movement. We'll talk a little bit more about those groups a little bit later on. Another term that you'll want to recognize, Maratha, is a term for a southern Indian state that rebelled against the Mughals and actually fairly successfully were able to overthrow the Mughal government and take control themselves of much of India. So we think about the Mughals as a really powerful empire during this time, which they were, but they were not all powerful. They didn't control all of India. And in fact, they themselves were, overthrown, were defeated by a resistance movement. The lower left-hand side, we've got the Cossacks. This is a multi-ethnic group, so it's a broader term, but referring to horse-riding peoples of southern Russia who actually helped the Russian state expand. So they were on the side of the government rather than being a resistance movement themselves. And then Eric previewed this in the chat for those of you who tuned in before we got the stream started. Privateer is another word for pirate. Privateers specifically are licensed pirates. They were commissioned by governments. Commission is just a fancy word for given a license, literally given a license by the government to be pirates against the ships of rival nations. So the privateers are another example of resistance against imperial growth. All right, I just got a message from Mr. Little. He is running later than he planned. So I'm going to keep talking and give you the best I can. I'm going to be really transparent here and let you know that some of these slides are on content that I haven't prepped for my students yet. So I'm a little bit less familiar with these. So I'll give you as much detail as I can. But some of the slides we may end up skimming over just a little bit in order to give you the best content on what I know and give you time to ask questions. And please always interrupt with questions, comments, thoughts. Eric is reminding me that all 4 of these are examples of limits to imperial power, which is great. So one of the ways to break down resistance movements is to think internal versus external. And we can start with some external challenges, right? Some of the limits to imperial expansion come from running into other people. And so a couple of kind of big examples of external challenges to empire growth would be the Ottoman-Portuguese Wars in the Indian Ocean, which we'll talk about in just a minute, and then piracy in the Caribbean. So we've got outside forces working to stem both of these empires. I also want to second the point that Eric has just made in the chat, which is that this is one of those lessons, and AP World in general is a class where it can start to feel really overwhelming, like you need to know every example that I'm going to share with you perfectly. You don't. Even as a teacher, I don't know every one of these examples in equal depth or detail, because the reality is that you would only need to know one of these to use as an example in an essay. If you were given an essay prompt about resistance to empires from 1450 to 1750, and you wrote your whole essay about, Ottoman-Portuguese Wars in the Indian Ocean, you would be fine. But you don't have to know every single one of these. You need to know one, you need to know it pretty well. You need to feel confident in your understanding of it. And you want to recognize as many of the other vocabulary pieces as you can, so that if you see something that links, that makes a connection to what you know, you can expand on that connection in your writing. All right. Oh, look at that. Eric even said that he had to look up one of Mr. Little's examples, and he's been teaching world history even longer than I have. So there you have it. We're all learning together here on our stream tonight. All right. Ottoman-Portuguese Wars. I'm just going to put the whole slide up here because this is not one of the examples that I spend a lot of time teaching my classes, but it is worth thinking about as an external challenge to empire. The Portuguese represent a challenge to the expansion of Ottoman power in the Indian Ocean by coming in and creating their trading posts and disrupting Ottoman power in the Indian Ocean. It's also true that the Ottomans represent a limit and a challenge to Portuguese attempts to expand their empire through trading posts in the Indian Ocean. So both of these powerful empires represent a check to each other. And as they came into conflict with one another in the Indian Ocean, they attempted to get indigenous peoples throughout the Indian Ocean to take sides with one side or the other. We see numerous documents coming out of India, for example, of Ottomans writing to Indian rulers saying, hey, you can't let the Portuguese come and trade here. They're going to mess everything up. They're going to take over in the Indian Ocean. We get the Portuguese coming in and trying to dissuade rulers from making deals with the Ottomans, claiming that, the Portuguese are going to be better for business. And so everybody's trying to get the most land under their control, but also the biggest trade networks under their control. And so this series of wars in the 1500s represents a check to the imperial growth of both of these states. There, here you can see on the slide, you can see some examples and some language that's giving you information. And if you wanted to jot these down or take a screen cap of this slide, these would all be things that you could look up, could add into your notes as some detail about the Ottoman-Portuguese Wars, especially if that's something your teacher is using as an example in class. I also mentioned the pirates. Because everybody loves thinking about pirates, and this is probably an example that's going to stick in a lot of people's heads. Piracy from the 14 to 1800s is not new, right? I think it's important to acknowledge that piracy predates the 1400s, but we often think of piracy in this era of the 1400s to 1800s because there was so much of it going on. And in fact, there were pirates in the Caribbean. I know it's such a Disney trope, and it's easy to be like, it's all just fake. They just made it up for the movies or for the ride or for whatever. But actually, the movies and the ride have their, very, 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 very tenuous roots in some real history. Don't rely on the movies to give you that history, but know that they are taking from some real history. And in particular, we've got those licensed privateers, right? So in order to check particularly Spanish power in the Americas, the English and the French gave commissions to privateers to attack Spanish ships. The Spanish were bringing home loads and loads of silver out of the Americas and gold as well, a lot more silver than gold. And the English and the French didn't have access to those mines, but they wanted that silver and gold. So they would attack the ships and simply take the treasure from the ships. However, we also see, right, that these privateers turn into straight up pirates. And the reason we use these two words differently is that the privateers are licensed for a particular purpose and for a particular government. The pirates are working for themselves. And the pirates realize that they can become independently wealthy and independently powerful if they just start attacking whatever ships they want and keeping the money for themselves rather than working for another government. And so we actually see some of the more famous pirates in the Caribbean actually establishing themselves as rulers, in some cases, of their own islands. Many of them, as they grew in power and then were challenged by other pirates, would even sometimes turn legit and go back to working for the English or French governments as governors on various Caribbean islands in the colonies in order to consolidate their power that way. I mentioned already these Caribbean pirates are targeting Atlantic shipping. So they're looking for those treasure ships headed back across the Atlantic from the Americas to Europe. And by targeting those ships, they're hurting the growth of the empires economically by cutting off some of the source of their wealth and their treasure. But piracy in this era is not limited to the Caribbean. We also should acknowledge that piracy is rampant in East Asia as well. Piracy is most common in places where there's the most shipping. So from the 14 to 1800s, we've got a ton of shipping from the Caribbean, from Latin America, across the Atlantic to Europe. So there's a lot of piracy in the Caribbean because there's a lot of islands, places to capture ships, places to hide from navies. East Asia and Southeast Asia are very much the same. Because we have a lot of shipping coming in and out of the Indian Ocean. There are a lot of islands, there are a lot of safe harbors and ports in southern China and in Southeast Asia. And so we have a lot of piracy in that region, a lot of smuggling happening of goods. Smuggling is just trade that avoids paying taxes levied by a particular government. So if you can get your goods into the market without paying the taxes, the customs fees or duties, then you can get even richer because you can charge the same prices as someone, or even just a little less than someone who's paying taxes. But because you didn't have to pay the taxes, you get to keep a lot more of those profits. One of the most famous pirates in East Asia during this time period is Shih, who is especially remarkable for the fact that she's female. She is not only a woman, she's one of the most successful pirates in any part of the world in any time of world history. She was successful versus the Chinese Navy. She's successful versus European navies and the Portuguese. She was so powerful that the Chinese government hired her to help defend their coastline as European incursions start to threaten the Chinese coastline. And at the end of her career, she negotiated amnesty with the Chinese government and a retirement package that allowed her to keep the equivalent of millions of dollars in wealth for herself and all of her sailors, because she had a whole fleet of pirate ships. And as a pirate, right, represents a check to both the power of the Chinese government, but also the Europeans and their expansion into East Asia. So these pirates both make for really good storytelling, but they also represent a significant development in world history. So that's a couple of different examples of external resistance. Mr. Little didn't have a slide for me to stop for questions here. He wants to go straight into internal resistance, but I'm going to pause for questions because I've been talking for a while. What questions do you have about any of this? You're just so wrapped up in my pirate stories that now you're all off Googling pirates. All right, well, keep your pirate Googling in a separate tab so you can stay tuned into the stream, because I do want to give you a couple of examples of internal resistance. So if external resistance are powers outside of an empire, checking its growth and preventing it from expanding further, internal resistance, right, would be people within the empire itself who attempt to prevent the empire from growing or from consolidating its power. And so we're going to look at the Maroon societies in Brazil and Jamaica, and then at the Cossack revolts in Russia. I know a little bit more about the Maroons than I know about the Cossacks, so I'll probably spend a little more of my time there. And again, like Eric pointed out earlier, you don't need to know every example. You should know one external example, one internal example. And if these examples are really stickable for you in your brain, awesome. If they're not, there might be one in your textbook or the review text that you're using to study for AP World that is more stickable. And that's great as well. This is not like the be-all end-all for these examples. So these Maroon societies, remember that these are societies created by escaped slaves and by Native Americans, typically, right, in order to avoid re-enslavement. Maroon societies would settle and create their communities in really remote areas. So they're going to be far from large urban settlements. They're going to be far from other Europeans, and they're going to be pretty far from the coast. They're going to be relatively far inland. Now, Jamaica doesn't have a ton of, it's not the biggest island, but relatively speaking, we can talk inland. I mean, in Brazil, definitely. And in some cases, right, one of the ways that these Maroon societies, in addition to their existence, one of the ways that they were resistant against empires is by raiding the plantations that were nearest to their settlements, thereby disrupting, right, the economic system of enslavement on the plantations, right? That's a form of resistance in and of itself, but also then a way to like take the goods, take the crops from those plantations and utilize them for themselves. So it's kind of a double benefit to raid those plantations. Some notable examples to think about. My Portuguese is not awesome, so I'm not going to promise my great pronunciation here. But the Quilombo dos Palmares in Brazil, the Jamaican Maroons. And again, this is a place where we can remember the valuable role of women in world history. There's a famous Jamaican Maroon leader known simply as Queen Nanny. And she's a really interesting story. She's a powerful woman of African descent, an enslaved person who escaped and became a real leader in her community and a resistance leader against the European powers in Jamaica. It's worth noting, right, that one of the reasons these Maroon societies are successful is that many of the slaves that are being brought to the Americas were initially captured as prisoners of war. So in many cases, these are trained warriors. These are young men in the prime of life. And if they were able to survive the passage across the Atlantic, able to survive the horrific conditions of enslavement, these are physically strong and powerful people who then are able to engage in direct resistance and raids against the plantations because they have the skills and the physical abilities to do so. It's also true that these, look at this, Eric dropping us some more links, another podcast about Queen Nanny and the Haitian Revolution and these Maroon societies. I would definitely encourage a listen to that podcast. But these Maroon societies also are a place where we see cultural blending happening. So in addition to being an example of resistance against expanding empires, these Maroon societies are an example of another important concept from Unit 4, which is that blending of cultures. Cultural syncretism is the word that often gets used. And so we see a blending of Native American culture, of various African cultures. We see linguistic blending, cultural blending that also includes like religious traditions to create unique and individual communities. So we use this broad term of Maroons, but it's not like there was like a united Maroon society. They were individual communities creating their own cultures and societies and resistance movements in their own communities. This is where, right, and I've mentioned this already, but this is where Mr. Little wanted to remind us, right, that for some people in world history, existence is resistance. That their very existence, right, that escaped enslaved people, by living out their lives as escaped enslaved people, that existence, even if they never raided a plantation or never successfully freed other slaves, they represent resistance against the model that these empires are perpetuating as they're expanding and consolidating their power. So when we talk about resistance movements, we don't just have to talk about violence. We don't have to talk about battles. We can talk about, right, people who create a life that is separate from and contrary to the expected order of things that the political powers are trying to create. So that's just kind of like a note to keep in mind and to think about as you're trying to process this information and how you might use it to create an interesting and complex argument. All right. So this is where I'm, again, going to give you a whole slide at once because the Cossacks are not my area of expertise, but I do think that they're interesting, and I want to be able to give this to you as a great example because Mr. Little put a lot of time and energy into creating these slides, and I want to honor his hard work that he's done. So the Cossacks, right, this is a multi-ethnic, diverse group of people. He calls them horse-riding peoples, which might make some of us think of the Mongols. And that's not crazy, but we're not talking about the Mongols. We're talking about people much further west. So what we think of as more Ukraine, southern, kind of European Russia is where we're thinking about. And initially, right, they were employed. We can use that term loosely because they're almost more like enslaved people, but technically paid, employed by the czars of Russia to help expand their territory. Right, these horse-riding people would have been skilled militarily. They would have been really successful potentially as a military force to help the government expand. But they themselves didn't necessarily want to be part of this expanding Russian Empire. They didn't want to be under the authority of these Russian czars. And so we see in the 1670s, the Stenka revolt, and there are actually a number of Cossack revolts, but this one in particular sought to form an independent republic in southern Russia. This is an example of a failed resistance movement, largely because these Cossacks because they were in southern Russia, they're very close to the centers of power in Russia. They're very close to the urban centers, to where like the political leaders are, to where the military can be gathered from. And so the revolt was suppressed, and rather than creating a new independent state, they were simply reabsorbed back into the Russian Empire. All right, questions about these internal examples of political and economic resistance? Sorry, I'm just doing a quick check of my messages to see if Mr. Little was back, because I really want to give him a chance to talk about some of these things that he knows better than I do, and that he has prepared. He's done such a great job of setting this up and making sure that we can get through this content together. And I love where he takes this lesson next, which is to think about the fact that imperial resistance isn't simply political. It's not simply economic. Both of those are really important factors, but religion plays a key factor in as well. And so one of the examples we can think about is with the rise of Sikhism in the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire under Aurangzeb in particular becomes much more Islamist. So it's favoring Muslims over other groups within India, and begins to really impose Islam on peoples in a way that previous Mughal rulers had not done. I'm going to pause here for just a second because I've got a family member popping into my space here right now. Okay, I need you to go back to your room and I will come check on you when I am finished with this lesson, please. Okay, you can go ask your dad about that, or you can go back in your room and wait for me. I will be there in a little while. Go. Sorry about that. Kids with needs. But so you hopefully in your classes either have or will learn a little bit about Sikhism. And one of the things we can know in terms of Sikhs and resistance is that Sikh communities refuse to convert to Islam. They resist forced conversion as a whole. One of the tenets of Sikhism is a belief in tolerance and acceptance of religious practice. And so, being forced to convert to another religion is really contrary to what they believe. And forcing anyone to convert to Sikhism or to any other faith is really contrary to what they believe. And so their gurus, their wise teachers, really led the charge in resisting the imperial policies of these Mughal leaders, even to the point of being killed for refusing to convert. So that would be an example of religious resistance. We can also think back in Europe about Protestantism, right? Protestantism and the Protestant Reformation is this protest against the Catholic Church and a movement to resist some of the powers that were particularly important in Europe. Jed's going to talk about this on Sunday, so I'm not going to steal all of his thunder. But it represents not just a religious protest, but also a political protest, because we see princes resisting Catholic rulers, Catholic leaders. And so we start to see the makeup of parts of Europe shifting, either more Catholic or more Protestant, depending on the way that the leaders were leading their people in a particular area. So some princes in a particular area might actually attempt to gain independence from a king or a ruling lord to make that happen. But yes, Sasha's also mentioning, right, that it's a protest against the overspending of the Pope. So we've got a political, religious, and economic piece all being combined in this Protestant Reformation. All right. So we're doing awesome on time, everybody. We're going to make it through everything. So that's like the big bulk of my notes. What I've got here next for you is some practice. And we're going to start with some multiple choice practice, but just to kind of run you through expectations on the AP exam for multiple choice. Multiple choice are all what we call stimulus based on the AP exam. So there's going to be a text or a map or a picture or two. That's the stimulus. And the questions all come in groups, generally 3 to 5 questions per stimulus. And among those questions, you might end up with a connection question. Usually, connection questions ask you to link 2 or more places or 2 or more developments. So an example of language you might see is, which of these 2 both illustrate the following process? Or, Empire A and Empire B share all of the following except. And I find those except questions to be some of the most challenging on the exam because it's asking you to think of not what is the true and correct answer, but what is the incorrect answer among all of the true and correct answers. So you really want to watch that language as we're doing these practices. So that's kind of generally what a multiple choice question looks like. Here is a sample stimulus. And for those of you on phones who can't see it as well, I will read the stimulus out loud and then I'll give you the question. So the source line at the bottom here says that our speaker is William Boesman, a chief agent of the Dutch West India Company on the West African coast, 1686 to 1702. And he says, I have met twice with this misfortune. The second time it fell heavier on another ship, and that chiefly by the carelessness of the master, who, having fished up the anchor of a departed English ship, had laid it in the hold where the male slaves were lodged, who, unknown to any of the ship's crew, possessed themselves of a hammer, with which, in a short time, they broke all their fetters in pieces upon the anchor. They would certainly have mastered the ship if a French and English ship had not very fortunately happened to lie by us, came to our aid. The Portuguese have been more unlucky in this particular than we, for in 4 years' time they lost 4 ships in this manner. So this document is relating to the slave trade. If you didn't recognize that initially, right, there's some clues here for us. We're thinking about this is a Dutch West India Company representative. So this is somebody in the Caribbean who's operating on the West African coast. He's talking about shipping. He mentions slaves. All of the following are consequences of the slave trade, except, and I'll just pull all of the answers up and let you look at them so that you can give a guess for your answers. So we've got A. So all the following are consequences of the slave trade, except the formation of Maroon societies in Brazil. B, an increased number of slave revolts. C, the creation of voodoo in the Caribbean. Or D, the conquest of the Americas. I'll underline some key thoughts in the text, if that was helpful. So Sasha's given us an answer. Sasha thinks it's D, the conquest of the Americas. We can see in the text, right, we can eliminate B because we're seeing, right, an increased number of slave revolts. We know, right, that Maroon societies are a consequence of the slave trade because they're escaped enslaved persons. And then this text doesn't specifically relate to the creation of voodoo in the Caribbean, but voodoo is a blended religious tradition that combines some elements of Catholicism, elements of Native American practice, and elements of African religious practice. So it's that blended culture that I did talk about with these Maroon societies. And so, yeah, that leaves us with D. Plus, as Sasha points out, right, the conquest of the Americas is one of the reasons for the slave trade rather than a consequence of the slave trade. That's exactly right. You're on top of things, Sasha. Thanks for being with us. Questions. All right, looking at the time that we have, Mr. Little has a whole bunch of other examples that we could talk about, but I'm going to jump us to a short answer. Because I think I think the best use of our time for this last 7 minutes would be some practice. So we have an image here, and this caption at the bottom is telling us about the image. So we have Jamaican Maroons negotiating with the British at the end of the Maroon Wars. Though it was published in the Slave Resistance, a Caribbean Study, the original source of this particular image is unknown. So the SAQ prompt that goes with this asks you to explain one example of another society that confronted an expanding Eurasian power in the period 1450 to 1750. I would say rather than thinking of another society, let's take this example as our SAQ practice, right? If we're thinking about these Jamaican Maroons, can we write this as an SAQ response where we explain, right? Explain to me how the Maroons represent resistance to an expanding Eurasian power. I talked to you about it. So repeat, tell me back. What are some of the things that you learned about these Maroons? Okay, they use their military skill to fight against the Europeans. Yep. So as we're thinking about this, if we were going to write this as an SAQ response, an explain question is always going to ask us for the greatest amount of detail. So we're going to take Sasha's example that Maroon societies, such as these Jamaican Maroons negotiating with the British, resisted European power in the Caribbean by using their military skills and abilities to raid plantations near their settlements, thereby disrupting the economic system of slaveholding plantation owners in the Caribbean. That would be my example of an explain for that particular topic. I could also, use that idea of existence is resistance, and I could say that one way enslaved peoples such as the Jamaican Maroons resisted European power was by creating independent communities outside the rule of European powers within territories that Europeans claimed. The very existence of these communities was a challenge to European power because they refused to acknowledge European authority and because they refused to acknowledge European practices such as slavery. So in both of those answers that I've just given you, notice that I'm giving a little bit of specific detail and that I'm connecting my initial answer to my details with just a little bit of explanation. So for these explain SAQ prompts, you're really looking at a 3, maybe 4 sentence number isn't important, but people always ask me, a 3, maybe 4 sentence response to give that complete thought to go along with that. So there's a couple of examples for you. With just a couple more minutes, because I've ended up doing this whole stream, and I feel terrible that Mr. Little hasn't been able to jump in and give you the wealth of his great knowledge on this topic. What questions do you have? What are things? Oh, I'm going to invite Mr. Little on screen. He can answer some questions. Let's do it. Let's do it. Focus. Oh, all right. There it is. There's my, I can do this now. Nope. Sorry, it's been a little while since I've invited somebody on screen. Let me find, there he is. There's Mr. Little. I'm going to invite him on screen and let him talk to you a little bit. Right. Let's see if he'll jump in and join us. He's connecting. He's going to talk to you now.
Hey there.
You made it.
Yes, well, things, best laid plans, as they say.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for taking so much. I did not intend to leave you hanging like that, but
you left us with a great lesson. We were able to work through it. It was a team effort.
Well, that's good.
Sasha was really holding it down for us in the chat.
I was just looking at the chat. It looked like there was some good back and forth going there. Well, it's kind of jumping in here at the end, but if there were any questions or things I could clarify, maybe I didn't put in the notes, I would be happy to clarify those or discuss those if anybody from chat had a question or if you had a question.
Folks in the chat, if you were like, hey, Melissa did not give us what we wanted to know about those Ottoman-Portuguese Wars, this would be a good chance to ask about that.
Well, that's an interesting example. Now that you mentioned that, that's actually something I'm learning a bit about myself. There's a great book that's been published about that. But yeah, I'd put that in. There's a great example of an empire versus an empire, where the Portuguese tried to build this trading post empire in the Indian Ocean, but as it turns out, the Ottomans decided that they also wanted to assert their authority in the Indian Ocean. You have this 100-ish year kind of small Cold War that goes on between the Ottomans and the Portuguese. It's really interesting. There's a couple books out there that talk in depth about it. Real good stuff. Sasha's asking Cossacks, a little bit about the Cossacks. So yeah, that's actually interesting because that's one of the ones that they just included in the new course framework. And who the Cossacks were is they were this. It's not so much an ethnicity as it is like a way of life, I guess is a good way of phrasing it. They were a diverse group of people, but they lived in what's now like southern Russia, parts of Poland, parts of the Ukraine, where like it's really flat, and so they're horse riders, but they were used by the Russian government during many of their military campaigns against, most famously against Napoleon. But also just in the act of conquering Siberia. If you know, like Russia, if you've seen Russia on a map, you know it's like all of Siberia. Cossacks were usually at the forefront of the Russian military forces. So the Russians paid these Cossacks to work for them. But sometimes this happened like every couple decades. You had Cossack leaders who got really enthusiastic and decided, we're not really going to work for the Russians anymore. We're going to work for ourselves. And they would try to rise up against the Russian ruler and establish an independent republic. And the Raznin rebellion is just one of the more well-known ones that happens to fall in this time frame. And he tried to form an independent Cossack republic in southern Russia. And eventually he was defeated by the Tsars, and he was executed in a quite unfriendly manner. But this was not the only one. This happened again, like I said, every couple dozen years, you had another group of Cossacks rising up, and they were militarily very effective. They rode horses. And so they were a military challenge to the Russians until the Russians fully occupied their territory in the late 1800s. And they were fully incorporated. So that's a little bit when we talk about like social revolts, the Cossacks not necessarily as like an ethnic group, but a kind of a way of life, a social group within the Russian Empire that sometimes did not like being in the Russian Empire. And Genevieve asked a question about the book that I was reading, and Eric mentioned it. It is the Ottoman Age of Exploration. That's the one that kind of talks about this rivalry between the Ottomans and the Portuguese. Is there anything else I can clarify? Actually, one thing, Melissa, could you go to the slide about the Marathas? I think I want to really make sure we get this one thing.
Yes, I skipped the Marathas entirely for time. So
yeah. So really quick, just this term that I've put here, Hindavi Swaraja. This is a term that's actually, and I put this in here because it's going to be important, like down the road in world history. Like this is kind of a term that Gandhi and a lot of the leaders of the Indian independence movement are going to use against the British. But basically, it means self-rule for India, and disputed but not necessarily disproven that the first Maratha leader wrote this in a letter, and he said, my objective is Hindavi Swaraja, which means, self-rule by Indians to drive out the Mughals. And so this term is really interesting to kind of be associated with this Maratha state, and then later used by the Indian independence movement in the 20s, 30s, 40s, while they're striving for independence from Great Britain. So this idea is quite old, and I thought it'd be good groundwork for a future connection.
Yeah, since this whole lesson was about making connections, let's get that vocab out there.
Yeah. Anyways, those are just the two things that I wanted to help clarify. I'm sure you did a wonderful job with the rest of it, and hopefully this won't ever happen again.
Stuff happens. We've all got it, and we're a team. So I appreciate the work you did on the slides. It made it really easy to just power through all of this good content.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. And I'll let you get back to whatever you were doing.
All right. Well, East Coast people, you better get some sleep. West Coast people, you should also get some sleep, and have a great rest of your week, everybody. And we'll see you all on Sunday with our great student-led streams.
Go learn how to read those textbooks.
That's right. Learn how to read those textbooks. Have a great night, everybody.